Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the third in this series of talks on Palestine by Al-Mawrid Canada. We have with us Professor, a scholar of Palestine, along with international relations and political science, called Achin Vanaik. He has been a fellow and associate at the Transnational Institute since 1987. He's been a retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi as well. He's a long-standing activist for nuclear disarmament, and he has been an active member in the Indian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, working to pressure Israel to comply with international law. Achin is an author of several highly acclaimed books, among them the highly cited The Furies of Indian Communalism, Religion, Modernity, and Secularization, which was published by Verso in 1997. Achin is also a founder of the Society for Marxist Studies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Achin, who will speak for another 40 to 45 minutes, and thereafter we'll have a Q&A session. Achin, you're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Is that okay now?
Yeah, that's okay.
Can you
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Danish and Yusuf and others for inviting me to speak here. I'm not going to speak about the changing trajectory of India's relations with Israel and Palestine, which is important, but that's something that can come up in the discussion. And also not going to speak on the similarities and contrasts between Hindu nationalism and Jewish nationalism, or if you like, between what's called Hindutva and Zionism. Again, that's something that's very interesting, and I'm happy to take it up later on. So what I'll do is really give you a kind of general overview of the history of the evolution of the Israel-Palestine issue. But let me start first by highlighting the ways in which Israel is unique in the world of nations. Now, what do I mean by that? Number one, Israel is carrying out the longest running illegal military occupation of the last 150 years, one that is sustained by the most brutal forms of overt and covert violence. Second, the number of people killed in Gaza by ground invasion and military assault by air and so on is greater in proportion to the population of Gaza, something like about 1.4%, if you like, is actually greater than in all the wars of the 20th century, when we are talking about the number of people killed in proportion to their population by direct military assault or ground invasion or whatever. To give you some idea of what this means, is that if we were to take the number of people killed, proportionally speaking, in India, it would amount so far to something close to 20 million people. That's something quite extraordinary, that this too is a uniqueness of Israel. Third, other nations have armies. Israel is an army with a nation. This is not an exaggeration. Not only does no government in Israel ever put any constraints on the armed forces, they are politically extremely important, supreme, even economically, they're extraordinarily important. In 2022, for example, the revenue gained from the export of all kinds of military equipment by Israel was over $12 billion, and 25% of that sales revenues actually came from Arab countries. When it comes to cybersecurity related, in 2022, it was over $8 billion. And everybody, apart from the Orthodox Jews, men and women, are compulsorily conscripted for a period of 3 years for men, 2 years for women. And that's, of course, very, very important. Do you know why? Because it helps to cultivate another particular distinctiveness of Israel. No country I know of has so assiduously cultivated the myth of perpetual victimhood. Here is a country that has the most sophisticated armed forces, a match for all the armies of the Arab countries put together. It is the only country in that region that has nuclear weapons. It is supported by the strongest military power in the world. And it goes on and on and on about how its existence is being threatened. Its existence. It's quite extraordinary that there are people there. Is that all? You may or may not be surprised to know that Israel, in proportion to the population of Palestine, in proportion, has the largest number of political prisoners in the world. The United States, of course, in proportion to the population, has the largest number of prisoners of all kinds, but I'm talking about political prisoners. And in many years, Israel has, in absolute numbers, the largest number of political prisoners, more than Russia, China, or anywhere else. Israel is the only so-called democracy that has a more terrible law, which is worse than the worst law in India, which is what is called the UAPA law. This thing here. It has what's called an administrative detention law, in which on mere suspicion, anyone can be arrested and put in jail for 6 months, which can then be extended indefinitely for years and years and years. And in this law, you don't have to charge anybody to arrest them, and you don't have to give evidence to the defense for them to mount any kind of defense for the persons arrested. It's extraordinary. And since 1967, close to 1 million Palestinians have suffered this kind of imprisonment. It may or may not be a surprise to know that Israel is the only so-called democracy that tries minors, Palestinian minors, in military courts. Israel is now the only country in the world that does not give a map delineating its borders to the UN. It's the only country that does not do that. Pakistan has a map claiming the whole of Kashmir. India has a map claiming the whole of Jammu and Kashmir, but Pakistan does not include New Delhi in its map, and India does not include Islamabad, Rawalpindi, Lahore in its map. But Israel includes the whole of Palestine, and even, of course, the Golan Heights. Yeah. And very recent, in September 2023, Netanyahu was at the UN General Assembly, in which he held up a map which showed that this is the way for peace in the Middle East in terms of this map of the whole of Palestine. So, is that all? Well, no. Let's take something else here. Israel is the only settler colonial apartheid state in the world today. It's the only settler colonial apartheid state in the world today. And lastly, it is the only state in the world that is not a state of its citizens. It is a state of the Jewish people everywhere, and its own non-Jewish citizens in Israel are axiomatically second-class citizens. There is no other state like this. The Islamic State of Saudi Arabia, the Islamic State of Pakistan, the Buddhist state of Myanmar are not the states of all Muslims. They're the state of Saudi Arabian citizens, of Pakistani citizens, of the Buddhists of Myanmar. But Israel is distinctive here. How did this Israel emerge? And what is it about history? And here I would like to start from, if you like, the last decade or so of the 19th century, in which you have the emergence of the Zionist movement, which is related to the very genuine oppression that Jews were suffering in Eastern Europe and under the Tsarist Empire of Russia. Christian Zionism, incidentally, comes several decades, almost 100 years before Jewish Zionism. It's important to understand because, for example, Lord Balfour was a Christian Zionist, and you had many others here who were Christian Zionists and who felt in the United States that's important that there be that. So even before Jewish Zionism emerged, which did not earlier focus on Palestine, but then later focused on Palestine, was something of a liberation movement for East European Jewry and those oppressed in Russia. But unlike all other national liberation movements of the Third World, Africa, Asia, which fought against imperialist and colonial powers, this was one which said that its goal can only come about by aligning itself with imperialist colonial powers. And that time, of course, in the late 19th century and, of course, the early 20th century, the most important colonial powers were Britain and France. And this is where what you have in the First World War, which was fought between France and Britain and Italy actually against the Axis powers, the Austro-Habsburg Empire and uh, Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Hmm. The British and the French, they met in 1916 while the war is over. There was a certain talk called the Sykes-Picot talks, and that was to really decide on what would be the division of control after the end of the First World War. Of course, in order to get support from the Arab public against the Ottoman Empire, there was also a pledge by, I mean, on one hand, you would have a kind of division of what remained of the Ottoman Empire in that part between France and Britain. But Britain also pledged independence to a number of Arab countries and their leaders, including Palestine. Hmm. But in 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration was a letter written to the Rothschilds as part of the World Zionist Federation to get support from the World Zionist Federation, which they felt had influence in the United States to bring it into the First World War, and to also appeal to Jews who were not on the left in Russia, because the Russian Revolution had taken place and they wanted to pull out of the First World War. In any case, the short and long of it was that they were saying, okay, we'll help you to get a national home in that area. In other words, Israel recognized that by helping the Jews to get a home there, they would themselves have a base there for further consolidation elsewhere. You had in 1920 the League of Nations, which established mandates. And later on in that year, you had the Balfour Declaration, the commitment to a national home for Jews, which was a fundamental contradiction of their pledge for independence to Palestine, also accepted as part of the mandate. The mandate was a kind of indirect form of domination until those countries would become independent. And even before India became independent in 1947, you had other countries that became independent, like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, under the influence of the French, and of course, Transjordan, Jordan, and Palestine, Iraq, under the British influence. However, all these other countries did get independence, but not Palestine. In fact, at the end of the First World War, a portion of Jews in Palestine, who had been there for some time, was about 8% or so, 6, 7, 8%, and they had less than 2% of the land. By the end of the Second World War, their population had risen to something like 30, 31, 32% of the population, almost a third, but they still only had about 6, 7% of the land, although a substantial portion of this was cultivated land, around 20% of the cultivable land. But that was what they had there. The British, after the end of the Second World War, instead of carrying out the commitment to give independence to Palestine, handed it over the issue to the UN, which was then, of course, dominated by the United States, some 50-odd countries. The Soviet Union was also there. And a special committee was set up to decide on the fate of the Palestinians. The fate of the Palestinians, you had a special committee. In that committee, apart from 3 countries, Iran, Yugoslavia, and India, that advocated a united federal Palestine, the majority said, let's partition it. And this partition was that although the Jewish population was 33%, they will get 55% of the land, the best proportion is cultivable land, and the remaining 2/3 will only get 45. The Palestinians and the Arab countries are shocked. They said, what are you talking about? We should be getting independence. The Zionists formally accepted it, but there was a deep, deep deception going on. 12 days before the UN partition plan was announced in November 1947, a secret offer and deal was being made with British mediation between King Abdullah of Jordan and the Zionist leadership. And that deal was that, because they knew that a war was going to come up, that Jordan will take over East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And in fact, when the war did take place, at the end of that war, that is exactly what happened with Egypt getting, the Gaza Strip. But let's take back to 1947, November, when that partition plan was announced. Between November 1947 and 1948, when Israel declared its independence, you had a shock at the partition plan, you had a civil war going on, and of course, the Jewish forces were much more organized. The Palestinians were not really expecting that they would be deprived in this way, much stronger. And one third of the Palestinians were actually displaced, going either to neighboring countries or to the West Bank or to the Gaza Strip. This was between 1947 November and May 14, 1948, when Israel declares independence. The other Arab countries come in. And in that war, from May 1948 till about March 1949, when there was ultimately an armistice, you had, apart from what I just mentioned about Jordan taking over the West Bank and East Jerusalem, you had the Gaza Strip under the control of Egypt. All else had been taken by the Israeli forces there. This was the state of affairs at the 1949. One of the great tragedies of Palestinians was that there was no real independent Palestinian leadership at that particular time. It was really much under the control of the other Arab countries. And this is important because the other Arab governments were obviously more committed to their own interests than they were to the Palestinian cause. So the Palestinian leadership there that they had, was called the All-Palestine Government, which is based in Gaza, was really under the domination of Egypt. And you have Israel established itself here, and you have then after that a huge influx of migrants coming in from all parts of the world, and they were coming into Palestine, although most of them wanted to go to the West and to the US and UK, but the US and UK actually put restrictions on them coming there so that they could encourage more to go towards Palestine. And they came there and they took over the houses, the homes, the furnitures of the Palestinian people displaced. By the end of that war, around 70% of the Palestinian people had been purchased. It was ethnic cleansing. And of course, there had been brutal murders and massacres at different places, including the poisoning of water supplies in Accra and so many other things that we talked about here. But let's leave that aside here. You have from 1949 to 1956, Zionist Israel consolidating itself. Incidentally, it's very important to understand that within Zionism, there were three broad currents. Political Zionism, which was saying we need a homeland to protect Jews. A cultural religious Zionism, was saying we need an independent Israel to protect Judaism. And when we protect Judaism, of course, the Jews will be there. And the third was a labor Zionism. A labor Zionism was that we want to establish a socialist Israel. And within that labor Zionism, there is even a more radical, a socialist current, if you like. And this labor Zionism was the inspiration of what was then established, the kind of cooperatives that were called kibbutz, and the histadrut, the unions of Jewish workers. But please note that the kibbutz and the histadrut excluded the Arab workers at all. So it was not a question of a united idea. There were differences about what kind of Israel they should have. But what was common to all of them, and that was most important, is that how can we have a Jewish state unless there is a Jewish majority? And therefore, common to all three currents was the only way that we can have this is by displacing the Palestinians, by ethnic cleansing, so that we are a majority. So that's something that one must remember, even when one talks about left-wing Zionism and so on. Okay, 1956, you have, of course, the Arab Revolution. You have Nasser coming to power through a military free officers movement in Egypt and so on. In the 1950s, you have the emergence of desire for Arab nationalism and so on, anti-colonial struggles in different parts of the world, so on. And what do you have? You have the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which was then under the control of the British. So the British, the French, and Zionist Israel collaborated to carry out an attack in 1956 for different reasons. The Israelis wanting more and more land, the Palestinians, of course, sorry, the British wanting to take over the Suez. The French also very much opposed to Nasser's support for the Algerians, because the Algerian struggle was taking place for independence of Britain. So different motives, they come there. They were stopped and prevented, even though they had gained ground, because at that time the United States was competing with the Soviet Union for support among the Arab world, and so they had to pull back. And that is when, after the Suez War, that Zionist Israel said, okay, it's not Britain and France that are so important. Yes, France is helping us, and they did help to set up a nuclear capability. But obviously, the United States is the most important country. That's the one that we have to actually move towards. And the United States also began to understand the importance of Israel for its overall plans, which became obvious after the 1967 war. The 1967 war was one in which, taking advantage of all kinds of tensions, I won't go on into that, the Israel launched an attack. And because they were the aggressors, because after 1956 there were UN forces there that were supposed to separate Israel from the other countries. Incidentally, when Israel joined in 1949, when it joined the UN, it joined it and accepted the condition of Resolution 194, which is that the Palestinians displaced, over the 70%, have a right to return to their own homes. They accepted that, but of course, ever since, they have completely betrayed it and got away with it. Anyway, they obviously they got more land. They got, in fact, the whole of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and they pushed out the Egyptians and got Gaza. So that is what happened in 1967 war, and that they became a very stable source, the single most important base, if you like, for American influence and domination in that part of the world. You had in 1964 the Palestine Liberation Organization set up, which was an umbrella body of different groups, but it was set up in 1964 under the control of Egypt. It is only after the 1967 war that you have, and of course, what happened, a battle called Karameh, in which Yasser Arafat's forces fought back against the Israelis, that you began to have a considerably independent PLO under the influence of Yasser Arafat and the Fatah movement that took place. And that is the historical significance of Arafat, and that he represented for the first time, unlike earlier on, PLO that was dominated and prioritized the interests of the Palestinians and not simply the interests of the other countries who were using the Palestinian cause for both good and bad reasons, if you like. So that was the historical importance there. And from 1968 till towards the latter end of the 70s, the PLO incidentally was not just Fatah. There were a number of other organizations, including left groups and some smaller Islamist groups also. And in fact, some of those left groups were saying that, and because at that time there was also the effort to move towards kind of Arab nationalism. Let's talk about an Arab nationalism. Let's talk about an Arab federation of Arab states. There was a sense that, in fact, the best way to move to the liberation of the Palestinian people is also to connect it to the struggle of the ordinary working people and poor in these countries to move away from dictatorships towards a larger entity. But anyway, these are different currents within that in 1970. Most of these currents, in fact, from 1968 onwards, decided that the best way to fight for liberation against the Zionist Israel is to engage in guerrilla warfare. And this was the period in which you had those famous hijacks and those different activities that taking place there. 1970, Nasser dies, Anwar Sadat comes to power, and 1977 he makes an approach saying to Israel and to the United States that, look, we are prepared to consider recognizing Israel, but we want our lands back. Because, of course, what had happened in 1967 is that Israel had taken over the West Bank, Gaza, but also a large part of the Sinai desert and the Golan Heights from Syria. So it taken all that, and even we could say a little slice in Lebanon. Oh, that comes a bit later. Anyway, you have this here. And in 71, Arafat is talking, and he's not getting any kind of response. So then he gets the Soviet Union to help him militarily. At the same time, he's looking towards the United States, which is the country that has most pressure on Israel, to in the future perhaps act as a kind of broker. So suddenly in 1973, you have the war in which Egypt and Syria fight an armed struggle against Israel, which took Israel by complete surprise and seemed to be very threatening because it did advance. But it was actually a war fought for peace, not a war to try to help the Palestinians at all. The Palestinians wanted the peace. This was to get back their land. And they fought to some extent. And then, of course, the Israeli army, after being set back and was on the verge of having real problems, they might even have considered using the nuclear bomb and any, otherwise we don't really know until we get more research and archival support. The Americans and the Soviets put pressure, and the Americans put pressure because the Israeli army towards the end, with American support, had partly surrounded the Egyptian army. Everything was halted. Yeah. And after that, between 1973 and 1978, 79, you have negotiations seriously between Anwar Sadat and the United States to put pressure. And you have the famous trip to Jerusalem by Anwar Sadat, which is a form of de facto recognition. And then you have the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, in which Egypt has a peace treaty, recognizes Israel, and gets back the Sinai. The Syrians are very upset. So the Syrians were quite upset because Sadat and the Egyptians weren't bothered about the Syrians and they weren't bothered about the Palestinians. They had their peace treaty and they got back there. And Israel was very happy and was prepared to that because Egypt was the most important, powerful military power in the Arab world. And they've got them out of the way. Forget about the Syrians and the Jordanians and others. And that became the kind of situation. Now, insofar as the PLO, the different currents had to fight a guerrilla warfare, they obviously had to be based in the neighboring countries, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, in order to be able to fight and do guerrilla actions. But as the Palestinian refugee population grew, and as the Palestinians also became significantly stronger than elsewhere, there was a lot of concern and worry by all of these leaders of Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon about the growing strength of the Palestinians, the possibility that they could link up with the oppressed and the poor in their own countries. And they also carried out actions against them. I won't go into that here. But don't forget that these leaders of the Palestinians, because the popular support in their countries for Palestine was real and therefore had to show themselves as supportive of the Palestinian cause, were much, much more interested in their own control over their countries and their own elite makeup and so on. And so you had repression, what was called Black September in Jordan in 1970. You had the Syrians going in to help the Maronite Christians against the Palestinians in Lebanon in the Lebanese civil war in 1976 and so on. So you had all of these difficulties that were taking place. And towards the end of the 70s, most of the Palestinian strugglers, the liberation movement strugglers, were beginning to come to the view that that guerrilla struggle is not really working. We'd have to think about something else. And what actually happened was that in 1982, using the excuse of an attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador in London, it didn't succeed. It was being done by a small group called the Abu Nidal group. But Israel immediately used this as an excuse to say that the PLO is responsible and Fatah is responsible, Arafat and others are responsible. And they used this excuse to launch a war in 1982 into Lebanon. And they advanced all the way to Beirut. And the Palestinian leadership of the PLO and others had to retreat to Tunisia, Tunis, to escape that. And this was the time when you had, in fact, the 1982 Sabra Shatila massacres by the Maronite Christians under the control and approval and support of Ariel Sharon and the Israelis. In fact, you had a Kahan commission in Israel which said that Sharon was guilty. That didn't stop him. He wasn't seriously punished. He became prime minister later on. But I'm saying that that took place here. And the Palestinian leadership largely outside of that here. The Israelis retreated from Lebanon because the Israeli public was quite disturbed by this. It was one thing, and they were approving of taking over the whole of Palestine and the 67 war and all. But they were also concerned that, look, Lebanon, if we start taking a large part of Lebanon, we are just going to increase the enemy of Lebanon. And what they and in the world also, what's the justification for taking over a huge part of Lebanon, as distinct from what was supposed to be Judea and Samaria? So, in fact, the Israelis pull out. And incidentally, it's after 1982 that Hezbollah emerges, because the Lebanese is divided into Maronite Christians, of which Maronites are a certain section, and you have the Shiites, and then you have the Sunnis. So you have mixed there, and even some Christians. Anyway, so there, what's happening in Palestine? In Palestine, in the occupied territories, 1987, something extraordinary happens. From the ground, with women and young people, particularly women, rural women, playing a huge role, there's a huge non-violent mobilization of protest against Israel and its occupation, which is met by one of the later Nobel Prize winners, Shimon Peres, with brutality in a campaign that he called Breaking Their Bones. So you had brutal repression of this. And this was a leadership that emerged from within. It wasn't a PLO leadership, really. It was from within. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been working, which is what Hamas was earlier connected to, was working there, but that was working on the ground in various ways, setting up support structures, welfare support structures through their mosques and so on. And it was even used from time to time by the Israel, which financed some of these mosques and the welfare institutions they were doing, as a kind of divide and rule against other sections there. But the 1987 uprising, what's called the First Intifada, was Hamas was not at all an important player, nor the PLO. In fact, it is after that you have the Muslim Brotherhood section in Palestine separating itself from the preoccupations of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is transnational, calling itself Hamas, which means Islamic Resistance Movement, and now saying we are simply a Palestine struggle, and then seeking to expand its influence here. And as PLO and Arafat are moving away from guerrilla struggle, they are carrying out suicide attacks and others to carry on the struggle here. One can talk about Hamas a bit later. The PLO realized that leadership is going out of its hands. Its guerrilla struggle is not moving. And therefore, in the 80s, late 80s, 88, they move towards an acceptance. Okay, you Zionist Israel, you have taken over, you took over 78% of our land after the 1948. At least give up the other 22% that you took in 1967. Give us back Gaza and this thing, and we will accept it. And then you began to have back-channel deals and discussions in Oslo, in Norway, which is why the Accords of 1993 are called the Oslo Accords, facilitated by the United States. And you had a majority of Palestinians coming to the view that, okay, there's been a great injustice to us, but we are prepared to seriously consider and accept a two-state solution, provided it is okay. But from the very beginning, the Israeli majority was not the Israeli leadership, the Zionist leadership, was very, very clear about what they wanted in many ways. And unfortunately, the leadership of the Palestinians, Arafat and others, under pressure from the US, moved towards negotiation and accepted the Oslo Accord in terms that shocked even their supporters of a two-state solution, who said this is absolutely wrong. Among the most important of those supporters, who was a great publicist for the PLO and who left the PLO, was, of course, Edward Said, who said that this is a disaster. Many others, Diana Boutina and so many others, said this is a disaster. And the Oslo Accords were a disaster. You know why? Because the PLO, Fatah, recognized Israel, not getting in return the recognition of the Palestinians to a state, but simply getting recognition for the PLO, which Fatah dominated, as the sole important representative of the Palestinian people. And that other matters, such as the actual boundaries of the Palestinian state, the question of the settlements which had already taken place, all these would be supported, and of course the right of return issue, all these will be supported in 1999. After 1999, they'll be supported. These will be the final status negotiations. But between 1993, Oslo Accords, and 1994, the number of Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem had already doubled from 200,000 to 400,000. Now there are more than 750,000 that exist over there. So you can see the kind of deception and the great mistake they actually made here. In 1994, you have a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, and it is only in 1988 that Jordan accepted that, look, we don't have control over West Bank; it'll be part of of an independent Palestine. But this is the situation. In 2000, you have your second intifada, great anger. Nothing has happened about the promise for even a two-state solution. You had all kinds of attacks, other things took place. Again, this was a non-violent one, not as non-violent as before, in which you had certain actions also, but only after a month of brutal repression. And it is here that you begin to have Hamas, after this, becoming more and more significant, because when they looked at what had happened in Oslo, they recognized the mistake that Arafat and the Fatah had done in recognizing Israel. The 1988 Charter of the Hamas had talked about, there was just an anti-Semitic element in it, also talked about them moving away and the whole of Palestine coming in. But by 2000, they themselves said, okay, we will promise a hudna, a long-term truce on the 1967 borders. And then we will see later on about what's going to happen. In other words, they were also coming around to that idea. And they were also thinking that it's better for the Palestinian forces to be united. And they were also pursuing a more route through what was set up, because the Oslo Accords, and this is very important, I forgot to mention, the Oslo Accords divided the Palestinian occupied Palestine into three parts. Category C, which would be 60%, in which Israel would have complete security and civilian control. Another 22%, category B, in which Israel will have security control and the Palestinian Authority, which was set up under Fatah, to have civilian control. But security controlled Israel. And lastly, the 18% of the most towns and all, in which the Palestinians would have security control and civilian control. But of course, the Israeli continuously violated that by sending in their own armed forces and others into even category A from time to time here. And in effect, what Oslo did was make the Palestinian Authority, headed by the Fatah, if you like, they had also a separate Palestinian National Council and so on, a legislative assembly, a kind of subcontractor, moving towards a collaborator of the occupation. That's in a certain sense what happened here. If you like, between 1967 and the Oslo Accords, you had Israel in control of the whole territory, and you had a large number of Palestinians working within Israeli factories and so on to earn a living and surviving here. From 1993 till 2003, when Ariel Sharon decides as prime minister that he's going to pull out the 8,000 odd Jewish settlers in the Gaza, which occupied about 40% of the territory along with the Israeli armed forces, and to make it a kind of open-air prison. You have the period of, if you like, unilateralism. The period of subcontracting, 1993 to 2003. And after 2003, it's Israeli unilateralism. We'll do whatever we want. And of course, there's acceleration of settlements, this, that, etc. The Fatah, which then joins the Palestinian National Council Legislative Assembly, has elections in which, surprise to everybody, they become the dominant factor. And they indicate to the United States that, look, we are prepared to consider this question of going back to the 1967 borders, a two-state Palestine. But Israel had no interest and was never seriously interested in this issue. From the beginning, if you want one simple sentence to summarize the Zionist approach to the Palestinian cause, the simple sentence is, as so many have pointed out, is more land, less Palestinians. From time to time, there would be divisions and differences within the Israeli ruling elite about what should be emphasized more. Maybe we should talk about having less land because there'll be more Palestinians that we have to deal with. And others saying, no, no, this, that, variation. But that is, like, the underlying thing. Even in the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians are accepted that we will be a completely demilitarized a nation state. The only nation state that accepts being completely demilitarized, and that they would have influence over the skies and all. But anyway, so what you had there is that this is the kind of situation that took place in 2006 when they won. It was a shock. Fatah, Israel, and the United States collaborate together. A certain war takes place between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas retains its influence in the Gaza, and the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in that area. And of course, more and more settlements coming in of various kinds. Yeah. And Israel reducing its dependence on Palestinian labor. And Israel getting a big influx after the collapse of the Soviet Union of more and more Jews from outside coming into there and seeking to expand its territory in the areas there. Incidentally, one thing I didn't mention, many of you know perhaps that the longest wall in the world is the Great Wall of China, which is the wall that can be even seen from satellites. The second longest wall is, in fact, the Israeli apartheid wall. The 1967 border, what's called the Green Line, separating the occupied territories from Israel, is 730 odd kilometers. From 2002, Israel decides to build a wall along this 730 kilometers. It is now 2024, and they've only built 70%. But what they built is already twice the length of 737, which makes it the second longest wall in the world. Second longest wall in the world. How is that? Because they went into the occupied territories and took more territory and more land. And the reality today is in the West Bank. Forget about Gaza, which is an open-air prison in which they've taken more and more land, is that in fact, no, it is completely discontiguous. Palestinians in the West Bank cannot move freely in any united way in the area that they have. There are any number of checkposts, this, that, posts, restrictions, blockades of all kinds, including flying checkposts, which are put in this place for some days and then without your knowing it, moved here. And life is miserable. And even as the attack on Gaza has been going on, there's been extended attacks on Israel, on Palestinians in the occupied territories. I should also mention something which I forgot to mention. Well, I'll come to that in the October 7th issue here. So you have this kind of a situation here. You have complete unconcern. And let's remember Hamas dominating. You had in 2018, you had the great march of return in Gaza, in which people marched towards the border fences to show their defiance. They're shot. Not just by tear gas and rubber bullets, they're shot by bullets, actual bullets. They're killed there. Yeah? And that's a long, non-violent march, doesn't matter. You have, from 2000 onwards, you have repeatedly what the Israelis call mowing the lawn. We have to show the Palestinians who we are, particularly in Gaza. And that, of course, meant that you had Operation Castlet in 2089, in which 1,400 Palestinians are killed on those ridiculous excuses, 600 children plus, all that. Yeah. And then you have in 2012 another assault. And then you have, of course, in 2014, what was the Operation Protective Edge, in which over 2,000 plus are killed and so on. And this is carrying on periodically in massacres here. And they think they've managed the situation. They've put into an open-air prison, and that's it. October 7th was a surprise. It never expected that here, the most sophisticated military here, that they would be able to actually go through from the sea and cut through the wire and actually make an attack here. Let's understand one thing, the difference between an occupier and occupied. The occupied have every right to fight for their liberation against the occupier, including by armed force. Yes, it's correct that even though you have the right to use armed force, there are distinctions that you must make. It is one thing to fight against Israeli soldiers, it's another thing to attack civilians. But when you talk about the occupier has no right to use any kinds of a means, whether it is violent or non-violent, to maintain its occupation. They have no right to do that. I mention this because it is quite shocking and quite disgusting that throughout the Western world, and not just in the Western world, I'm afraid, that you have this nonsensical talk about Israel's right of self-defense. You do not have a right of self-defense against a people or a territory that is illegal, occupied by you. Huh? But you use words to cover up, obviously, because in so many other ways, terrorists, this thing here, as if what Israel is doing is not terrorist attacks or terrorist campaigns, even before October 7th and so on. So you have all of the situation. And what is the situation today? Israel has used October 7th as an excuse to carry out a systematic attack there. And this is also part of a program which is very clear that they are not going to have back that situation. They want a large part of Gaza Strip, not only for further resettlement, but also as a kind of zone to squeeze them even more in that area, and also for economic reasons, which they share with even countries like Syria and others, and even outside in the UAE and others, because of oil and gas in the Levant Basin and outside of the Palestinian, on the Gaza waters, and building connections and pipelines and all, which can also benefit a whole lot of other countries, and they are definitely eyeing that as well. And there is a systematic campaign by Israel to kill off as many Palestinians in the Gaza as possible. Don't be surprised. This is genocide. I mentioned earlier how the proportion of people killed so much worse than that. This is a terrible genocide. Women and children, 40% have been killed, more than that. Hamas is an organization which does not just have a military wing, it has a whole welfareist wing of various kinds, an educational wing, administrative wing. You just have to label somebody terrorist and then you just kill them. And you get away with it these days. But by also killing women and children, they are not simply reducing the population of Palestinians in Gaza and what they're doing there, they're also reducing the capacity for them to reproduce. Today, the dominant view in Israel is that we have to take over as much as we can, including the West Bank, and they will have to live on our terms and accept it. So that's the kind of picture. And the shocking thing is that, in fact, look at the question of what the other governments in the world are doing. In fact, after the end of the Cold War, sorry, I've taken up a lot of time. At the end of the Cold War, what you had is more and more governments coming towards Israel, like India's and others, and as a counterweight, more and more support for the Palestinians in certain parts of the world. South Africa, Western Europe, North America. Not so much in India, I'm afraid. Where, of course, if you support it, you're a Muslim or a leftist. Largely correct. Some Southeast Asian countries and so on. But that's basically, if you like, it. So that's been the kind of counterweight. But after this, the countries of the West have literally let Israelis do everything that they want. Even more disturbing, and not entirely surprising, is what have the other Arab governments done? Apart from verbal denunciations, what have they done? You have not had any country that supported or joined, recognized Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, renouncing or withdrawing from that. You have not had the Arab governments which have had their own meetings using the oil as a weapon towards that. You've had denunciations, this, that, etc. will give aid and all that, which is the easy thing to do. And in a sense, one should understand why. And that is that you have dictatorships in the Arab world, etc. And a success for the Palestinian cause would be such a tremendous democratic gain. And because of the connection of support with the people within these countries, it would also threaten their military and their particular rule. And they are aware of this fact. The Palestinian cause for justice is not separate from the other cause of justice here. And you've had uprisings in West Asia, North Africa from time to time. Unfortunately, they've been set back, and you will have them in the future. But I mean, this is the overall situation in which you have it. What are the things that we can take for being, for ourselves or those of us who support? Solidarity by the countries and by movements outside is very, very important. Solidarity and opposition to what the Western governments are doing is the one way in which you can hope to make policy changes in these countries, of course. That's there. So that's important. But the thing that is most important is that in the coming period, and it's going to be a long-term struggle, how are we going to shift the relationship of forces to make the question of the right of the Palestinians for political self-determination something realistic and possible again? We have to leave it to the Palestinians to decide what is their form that they want for their right to political self-determination. In the discussion, I can talk a little bit about that. Usually people talk about the one state and the two-state solution. I can take that up and I can give you my views about that here. But how do we change the relationship of forces? For me, the way to change the relationship of forces is the following. You have to have a new kind of leadership of the Palestinians. Fatah, and there in the West Bank, is a subcontractor. That is it. Hamas has many, many serious problems with its own program based on a negative understanding of democratic rights of various cases, so on here. Second, you're not going to defeat Israel through military means. You will have to rethink how you're going to defeat Israel. And that really relates to generating a massive support on the ground between different sections of the public. And what do I mean by that? I mean connecting the struggle of the Palestinians within Israel. Remember in 2023, you had an upsurge of Palestinians within Israel who have always been arguing for equal rights because they are denied rights in Palestine. You have to connect them to the Palestinians in the occupied territories, which also want rights of various kinds. Even the rights or the laws of the occupation, there are laws under which your support or occupation are being denied by the Israelis here, plus other rights here. You have the diaspora, which is also fighting for the right of return, and they're also fighting here. And you have the people in the Arab world who are also wanting democratic rights for themselves over here. The best way is actually to move towards connecting these struggles. And the connecting that struggles is that for a considerable amount of time, let's keep the one state, two state thing in the back and all that. Let's talk about greater rights and equality for the people of Palestine in the occupied territories and there and there. And you will also need to have a new left emerge in Israel itself, which also endorses on the question of right. And the way to move that is, in my view, to move in this kind of a way towards generating that here. A newer kind of a leadership. To begin with, okay, you have Fatah and Hamas come together, but there are young people, more and more, in the West Bank and others saying that we need a newer kind of leadership. We have to put an end to this kind of corruption. We have to really move in a more sensible direction than the idea of martyrdom as the way to actually succeed in doing the here. So I think this is, and what we have to do from outside is provide as much solidarity and support that we can to them, and also to fight against our own governments, against the kind of lines that they have taken here. Let me end by pointing out that there are 29 countries that have no relations with Israel. 25 of those are Muslim majority countries. 15 of them in the Arab League, 10 others, Malaysia, others, which you don't have, Iran, and so on. 4 countries that don't have: North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and now Bolivia. Even though the South African parliament has said that South Africa should break relations with Israel, it hasn't done so yet. Yes, we appreciate what's happened with the ICJ and all that over here. Yeah. So that's something that we have to keep in mind here. Don't think that the Russians and the Chinese are really going to help the cause here. Maybe you can get some maneuvering diplomatically here, there, etc. But which is the country that supplies the greatest, most oil to Israel? Russia. There's an interesting similarity between India and Israel. Which is the country that provides most arms exports to India? Which is the country that provides more, between Israel and China, not India, Israel and China. Russia provides, what do you call it? Russia provides, China and India. Russia is number 1 supplier of arms to China. Russia is number 1 supplier of arms to India. Israel is the number 2 supplier of arms to India. And Israel is the number 2 supplier of arms to China. So you have an interesting situation. You think the Russians and the Chinese are going to exercise tremendous pressure on them here, apart from trying to maneuver, of course, like the Arab countries themselves are doing. The great source of hope is the remarkable, and I want to end here, the remarkable courage of the Palestinian people. Generation after generation, whether in the diaspora or elsewhere, keep on fighting. And the one thing that Israel cannot do as a settler colonial state is it cannot do what the first kind of settler colonial state did, because there are 3 kinds of settler colonial states. The first kind, South America, North America, Oceania, eliminating the overwhelming majority of the indigenous population. The second kind, Namibia, Algeria, South Africa, etc. The minority has to finally accept the end of apartheid, the majority comes to power. Israel is the third type. The third type in the sense that it's not like the first type. The majority population of Israel, of Jews there, is about rather a little bit more than that in the occupied territories at the moment, which is why they're doing what they want to do over there. The birth rate of Palestinians in the occupied territories is higher than that of the Jews, although the 13% Orthodox Jews have a high birth rate, but not enough. And Israel is having difficulty in now getting, after the first wave of Russian and East European migration of getting more and more people, even though they're offering incentives to try to move into the West Bank and elsewhere over here. Israel cannot eliminate the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people are determined to keep on fighting and fighting for their struggle. And that is something that we have to take our hats off. I really wish that this remarkable people had the kind of leadership that they deserve. That is something that we have to help them work towards. And of course, something that if does take place, they have a tremendous fillip for their struggle in the future. But they will keep on struggling. Israel is going to have more and more difficulties in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Achin. This was really a tour de force of a lecture and so much historical information packed with so much sensitivity and analysis. What we are going to do is take a short 5-minute break, if that is acceptable to everyone, and we're going to come back for a Q&A session and discussion. Thank you so much.